let anyone bully you into accepting unreasonable treatment, even over something as simple as where you put your snow. Stand up for yourself, stand up for what is right, and sometimes you might just change the whole world around you, or at least your neighborhood. And honestly, that was enough for me. I was staring at 3 police cruisers parked in my driveway on a Tuesday afternoon in Gilbert, Arizona, and I had no idea what I had done wrong. My name is Ian Edwards, and I had just spent the last 2 weeks building what I considered to be a beautiful outdoor bread oven in my backyard. The project had been approved by the building department. I had all my permits displayed on my front window, and I had hired a licensed mason to help me with the stonework. Yet here I was, watching 2 officers approach my front door while a third stood by their vehicles talking into his radio. The doorbell rang, and I answered it with flour still dusting my shirt from the test loaf I had been preparing to bake. The officer, a tall man with graying hair at his temples, looked at me with a serious expression that made my stomach drop. "Are you Ian Edwards?" he asked, his hand resting casually on his belt. "Yes, that's me." "What's going on, officer? We received a call about illegal construction on your property. The caller stated you were building an unpermitted structure that violates multiple city codes and homeowner association regulations. We need to inspect what you've built." I felt my face flush with a mixture of confusion and anger. "I have all my permits. The building department approved everything. Would you like to see the paperwork?" The officer's expression softened slightly. "Yes, that would be helpful." I invited them inside and retrieved the folder I had kept meticulously organized throughout the entire project. Inside were the building plans, the approval stamps from the city, the permit itself with a bright orange sticker indicating it was active, and even the receipt from the permit fees I had paid. The officer examined each document carefully while his partner radioed something back to the station. "These all appear to be in order," the first officer said, "but we still need to take a look at what you've built to verify it matches these plans." "Of course," I said, leading them through my house to the backyard. The outdoor bread oven stood proudly on a reinforced concrete pad, exactly where the plans indicated it should be. The mason, Roberto, had done an incredible job with the stonework. The dome-shaped oven was built from firebrick, surrounded by a beautiful layer of natural stone that matched the aesthetic of my house. It had a small chimney, a wooden door I had crafted myself, and a work surface area made from heat-resistant tile. The officers walked around it, taking photos and measurements. One of them made a phone call, reading off dimensions to someone on the other end. After about 10 minutes, they seemed satisfied. "Mr. Edwards, everything here looks legitimate. The structure matches your permits and you're well within your property lines. We'll file our report. Sorry for the inconvenience." "Can I ask who called this in?" I asked, though I already had a strong suspicion. "We can't disclose that information, but it was someone claiming to represent your homeowner association." Of course it was. I thanked the officers and walked them out, watching as the 3 cruisers finally left my driveway. I stood there for a moment, trying to calm down when I saw her. Patricia Mitchell, the president of our HOA board, was standing on her front lawn 3 houses down, her phone pressed to her ear, watching my house with narrowed eyes. Patricia was everything you would expect from a stereotypical HOA president. She was in her late 40s, always dressed like she was about to attend a country club luncheon even when she was just checking her mailbox. And she had made it her personal mission to ensure that every single home in our development of Sunset Ridge looked exactly the same. She had blonde hair that was always perfectly styled, wore too much makeup, and drove a white Mercedes SUV with a custom license plate that read, HOA Prez. I had heard stories about Patricia from other neighbors. She had fined the Johnsons for painting their front door a shade of red that was apparently 2 degrees too bright on the color spectrum. She had forced the Martinez family to remove a playground set from their backyard because she could see the top of the slide from the street. She had even tried to fine old Mr. Henderson for having weeds in his garden, despite the fact that they were actually native wildflowers he was cultivating for the local bee population. But I had done everything right. I had checked the HOA covenants before I even drew up the plans. There was no restriction on outdoor cooking structures as long as they met city codes and were not visible from the street. My bread oven was in my backyard, completely hidden from street view by my house and a privacy fence I had installed 2 years ago. I decided to get ahead of whatever Patricia was planning. I walked down to her house, my permit folder still in hand. She saw me coming and ended her phone call, standing with her arms crossed as I approached. "Patricia, did you call the police on me?" I asked, keeping my voice level. "I certainly did. You can't just build whatever you want on your property, Ian. We have rules here. I have all my permits. The city approved everything, and I checked the HOA covenants. There's nothing that prohibits what I built." She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Actually, according to Article 7, Section 3 of our covenants, any exterior modification to a property must be approved by the Architectural Review Committee before construction begins. Did you submit your plans to the committee?" I felt my confidence waver. I had read through the covenants, but they were 40 pages of dense legal language. Had I missed something? The bread oven isn't visible from the street. It's in my backyard. That doesn't matter. Any permanent structure requires approval. You should receive a formal notice of violation within the next few days. The fine is $500, and you'll need to either get retroactive approval or remove the structure. This is ridiculous. It's a bread oven, not a commercial development. Patricia's expression hardened. "Rules are rules, Ian. If we let one person slide, then everyone will think they can do whatever they want. This neighborhood has standards." I turned and walked back to my house, my hands shaking with frustration. Inside, I immediately pulled up the HOA covenants on my computer and started reading through Article 7. Patricia was technically correct. The covenants did state that exterior modifications required approval. But the section also included a clause stating that if a modification met all city codes and was not visible from common areas or public streets, the Architectural Review Committee had to approve it unless there was a specific, documented reason for denial. I had a plan. I would submit my application for retroactive approval, along with all my city permits and photos showing that the oven was not visible from the street. There was no legitimate reason for them to deny it. 3 days later, I received 2 letters in the mail. The first was the violation notice Patricia had promised, complete with a $500 fine, and a demand that I appear before the HOA board at their next meeting. The second was a notice that the Architectural Review Committee meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday, and I was welcome to present my case. I spent the weekend preparing my presentation. I printed large photos of the bread oven from multiple angles. I created a site map showing exactly where it was located on my property and demonstrating that it was not visible from any public area. I compiled letters from my immediate neighbors, the Petersons and the Wungs, stating that they had no objection to the oven and actually thought it was a nice addition to the neighborhood. I even got a written statement from Roberto, the mason, confirming that the construction met or exceeded all city and fire safety codes. Tuesday evening arrived, and I walked to the HOA office, which was located in a small building near the neighborhood entrance. The Architectural Review Committee consisted of 3 people. Patricia, naturally, a man named Douglas Barrett who rarely spoke, and a woman named Sharon Fitzgerald who seemed perpetually bored by the proceedings. I was the only item on the agenda. Patricia sat at the center of the table, looking at me with that same cold smile as I set up my presentation materials. "Mr. Edwards, you're here to request retroactive approval for an unpermitted structure built on your property," Patricia began, her voice formal and officious. "Yes, an outdoor bread oven. As you can see from these photos and documents, the structure meets all city codes, was built with proper permits from the building department, and is not visible from any public area." I walked them through each point of my presentation. I showed them the letters from my neighbors. I explained that the oven was built by a licensed professional and that I had invested significant time and money into ensuring it was done correctly. Douglas looked at the materials with what seemed like genuine interest. "This looks well constructed." "I don't see any aesthetic issues," Sharon nodded. "And it's not visible from the street. I don't see what the problem is." Patricia's smile had vanished. "The problem is that Mr. Edwards did not seek approval before construction. That alone is grounds for denial and removal of the structure." "But the covenants say that retroactive approval can be granted if the structure meets all other requirements," I countered, pointing to the relevant section in the document I had brought. Patricia shuffled through her own papers. "There's also the matter of the smoke and odor that will be generated by this oven. That could constitute a nuisance to neighbors. My neighbors already signed letters saying they have no objection, and I've only used the oven twice so far. There's been no complaint about smoke or odor." "Not yet," Patricia said sharply. "But what happens when you're using it every day? What about the fire hazard? What about the additional traffic if you decide to start a business out of your home?" "I'm not starting a business. I just like baking bread." "And the fire hazard is 0 because it was built to code and inspected by the fire marshal as part of my city permit." The meeting went back and forth for another 30 minutes. Douglas seemed sympathetic to my position. Sharon appeared indifferent but was leaning toward approval. Patricia was absolutely against it, bringing up increasingly absurd objections, including whether the oven might attract rodents or whether the heat from it might damage nearby plants. Finally, Patricia called for a vote. Douglas voted to approve. Sharon voted to approve. Patricia voted to deny, and she was clearly furious about being outvoted. "Fine," she said, her voice tight. "The Architectural Review Committee approves your bread oven. However, this doesn't dismiss your violation fine for failing to seek approval before construction. That will still be assessed, and you'll need to pay it within 30 days. I wanted to argue, but I was so relieved to have the approval that I decided to pick my battles. $500 was steep, but at least I didn't have to tear down the oven I had worked so hard to build. I left the meeting feeling cautiously optimistic. That optimism lasted exactly 3 days. On Friday morning, I received a certified letter from the HOA's attorney. The letter stated that upon further review, the HOA board had determined that my bread oven violated an obscure section of the fire code that had been incorporated into the covenants when the neighborhood was developed in 2008. According to this section, any outdoor cooking device using wood or solid fuel had to be at least 30 feet from any property line. I immediately went outside and measured. My oven was 27 feet from the nearest property line, the one I shared with the Petersons. I was 3 feet short. This was insane. The city had approved the location. The building inspector had signed off on it. The fire marshal had inspected it. But apparently, the HOA had their own rule that superseded all of that. I called the attorney's office listed on the letterhead. After being transferred 3 times, I finally reached someone who could discuss my case, a junior attorney named Michael Warren. Mr. Edwards, the HOA covenants are very clear on this matter. Your structure is in violation. But the city approved this exact location. How can the HOA have a rule that contradicts city regulations? HOA covenants are private contractual agreements. As long as they don't violate federal or state law, they can be more restrictive than city codes. When you purchased your home, you agreed to abide by these covenants. I understand that, but this particular rule wasn't enforced when the Architectural Review Committee approved my oven. I went through the proper channels. The board has the authority to review committee decisions. They've made their determination. You have 3 options. Move the oven to a compliant location, remove it entirely, or face ongoing fines and possible legal action. I hung up feeling defeated. Moving the oven would be nearly impossible without dismantling it completely. The concrete pad was poured in place, and the stonework was not designed to be relocated. I would essentially have to build a new oven in a different spot, which would cost thousands of dollars and months of work. That weekend, I did some research. I discovered that the fire code rule the HOA was citing had actually been updated by the city in 2015, reducing the required distance from 30 feet to 15 feet. The HOA covenants, however, had never been amended to reflect this change. I also discovered something else interesting. When I looked at satellite images of the neighborhood, I could see at least 4 other properties with outdoor fire pits or fireplaces. I drove around on Sunday afternoon and documented each one. The Hendersons had a large fire pit that was definitely less than 30 feet from their property line. The Simmons family had a built-in outdoor fireplace that was maybe 20 feet from the fence. The Carlsons had a wood-fired pizza oven that looked almost identical to my bread oven, and it was positioned in the corner of their yard, nowhere near 30 feet from either property line. I started asking around. None of these homeowners had been cited for violations. None of them had been forced to move their structures. In fact, the Carlsons told me they had built their pizza oven 4 years ago, and Patricia herself had complimented them on it at a neighborhood barbecue. This was selective enforcement, plain and simple. Patricia had decided she didn't like me or my bread oven, and she was using her position to harass me while ignoring identical situations elsewhere in the neighborhood. I compiled all of this information into a formal appeal, which I submitted to the HOA board along with a request to speak at their next monthly meeting. The meeting was 2 weeks away, which meant 2 more weeks of stress and uncertainty. During those 2 weeks, things escalated. I received another violation notice, this time claiming that I had been using my oven excessively and that the smoke was bothering neighbors. This was demonstrably false, because I had used the oven exactly 3 times since building it, and each time I had checked with the Petersons and the Wungs to make sure there were no issues. Both families assured me they hadn't complained and couldn't even smell smoke when I was using the oven. Then my wife, Bridget Owens, got involved. Bridget and I had been married for 6 years, and she had initially been skeptical about the bread oven project. She thought it was an expensive hobby and questioned whether I would actually use it. But once she tasted the first loaf of sourdough I pulled out of that oven, she became a convert. She had even started experimenting with pizza recipes. Bridget was a lawyer, though she practiced family law, not civil litigation. Still, she had a sharp legal mind and was furious about how the HOA was treating us. "This is harassment," she said, reading through the latest violation notice. They're making up complaints that don't exist. We need to fight this. I'm already appealing to the board, I said. I'm going to present all the evidence about selective enforcement at the next meeting. That's not enough. We should file a complaint with the state. HOAs are regulated in Arizona, and there are laws against this kind of behavior. Bridget spent the next evening researching Arizona's HOA regulations. She discovered that selective enforcement was indeed illegal under state law. She also found that HOAs were required to follow their own procedures, and apparently, Patricia had violated several procedural rules in how she was handling my case. For example, the board was supposed to provide written notice of any violation and allow 30 days for compliance before assessing fines. Patricia had issued the fine in the same letter as the notice. We decided on a two-pronged approach. I would present my case to the board at the meeting, and if that didn't work, we would file a formal complaint with the Arizona Department of Real Estate, which oversees HOA regulations. The night of the HOA board meeting finally arrived. The meeting was held in the same office where the Architectural Review Committee had met, but this time the room was packed. Word had spread throughout the neighborhood about my situation, and apparently, a lot of people were interested in the outcome. Some were there to support me, others were probably just curious, and a few, I suspected, were Patricia's friends who wanted to watch her put me in my place. The board consisted of 5 members: Patricia as president, a vice president named Richard Holder who seemed to be Patricia's yes man, a treasurer named Linda Wu who I had never met, a secretary named Tom Bishop who kept detailed minutes of everything, and a member-at-large named Karen Stephenson. When I saw Karen's name on the agenda, I almost laughed. Of course, there was a Karen on the HOA board. The meeting started with routine business, financial reports, updates on neighborhood maintenance. I sat in the audience, my presentation materials ready, while Patricia deliberately avoided making eye contact with me. Finally, after 45 minutes of mundane discussion, we reached the agenda item labeled Violation Appeal, Ian Edwards. Patricia's demeanor changed. She straightened in her chair and put on a performance of professional authority. Mr. Edwards has appealed the board's decision regarding his unpermitted bread oven. Mr. Edwards, you have 10 minutes to present your case. I stood and walked to the front of the room, setting up my materials on an easel I had brought. I went through everything systematically: the city permits, the approval from the Architectural Review Committee, the letters from neighbors, and most importantly, the evidence of selective enforcement showing other properties with similar structures that had never been cited for violations. When I showed the photos of the Carlson's pizza oven, I saw Patricia's jaw clench. Several people in the audience murmured among themselves. The HOA is applying rules to me that they have not applied to other homeowners, I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline pumping through my veins. This is selective enforcement, which is illegal under Arizona law. My oven meets all city codes, was approved by the Architectural Review Committee, and is not visible from public areas. There is no legitimate reason for the board to reject it. Richard, the vice president, jumped in before I had even finished. The situations are not comparable. The other structures you mentioned were all approved before construction, which is what you should have done. Actually, I spoke with the Carlsons and they never submitted their pizza oven for approval. They built it, and no one said anything. And even if they had been approved, that doesn't explain why their oven is allowed to be less than 30 feet from the property line while mine supposedly cannot be. Tom, the secretary, spoke up for the first time. Is that true? Was the Carlson structure approved by the committee? Patricia fumbled with her papers. I don't have those records in front of me right now. I do, I said, pulling out another document. I submitted a public records request last week. According to the HOA's own records, there is no approval application from the Carlsons. There's also no approval for the Henderson fire pit or the Simmons fireplace. The room erupted in conversation. Patricia banged a gavel on the table, calling for order. This meeting will remain civil. Mr. Edwards, your time is up. The board will deliberate and provide a decision within 10 business days. Wait, Tom said, still looking at the records I had provided. If we're enforcing the 30-foot rule against Mr. Edwards, we need to enforce it uniformly. That's basic fairness, and it's the law. Karen, the member-at-large, nodded. I agree. Either everyone has to comply or the rule isn't valid. Patricia looked like she had swallowed something bitter. We can discuss a neighborhood-wide inspection of outdoor structures at a later date. Right now, we're addressing Mr. Edwards's violation. Linda, the treasurer who had been silent throughout the meeting, finally spoke. Actually, I think we need to address this right now. If we rule against Mr. Edwards while allowing others to maintain similar structures in similar locations, we're opening the HOA up to a lawsuit. I don't think our insurance would cover that because it's willful selective enforcement. I could see Patricia losing control of the situation. Her face was flushed and her hands were gripping the edge of the table. Bridget, who had been sitting in the audience, stood up. May I speak? Patricia looked like she wanted to refuse, but Tom nodded. Homeowners have the right to address the board. My name is Bridget Owens. I'm Mr. Edwards's wife, and I'm also an attorney. I want to put the board on notice that if this issue is not resolved fairly, we will be filing a complaint with the Arizona Department of Real Estate for selective enforcement, procedural violations, and harassment. We have documented multiple violations of state HOA regulations and how this matter has been handled. The room went silent. Patricia's face had gone from flushed to pale. Richard looked nervous. Linda was nodding slowly, as if confirming something she had already suspected. Tom cleared his throat. I move that we table this matter, pending a full review of all outdoor cooking structures in the neighborhood, and a comprehensive assessment of whether the 30-foot rule should remain in the covenants given that it conflicts with updated city codes. I second that motion, Karen said immediately. Patricia had no choice but to call for a vote. The motion passed 4-1, with only Richard voting against it. As the meeting adjourned, several neighbors came up to thank me and Bridget for standing up to the board. Mr. Henderson, the elderly man with the wildflower garden, shook my hand vigorously. Someone needed to put Patricia in her place, he said. She's been running this neighborhood like a dictatorship for 3 years. Maybe now things will change. Over the next few weeks, things moved quickly. The HOA hired an outside consultant to review all outdoor structures in the neighborhood. The consultant's report, which was shared with all homeowners, found 23 properties with cooking structures, fire pits, or fireplaces that did not meet the 30-foot rule. The report also confirmed that the rule was based on an outdated fire code and recommended that the HOA covenants be amended to align with current city regulations. During this time, I continued using my bread oven without any further harassment. I even started a small blog documenting my bread baking experiments, which gained a modest following in the local community. The Petersons and the Wungs became regular recipients of my test loaves, and I discovered that I genuinely loved the craft of bread baking. But Patricia wasn't done yet. At the next monthly board meeting, she proposed that all 23 properties with non-compliant structures, including mine, should be required to either modify their structures or pay a special assessment fee to the HOA to cover the increased liability insurance costs associated with having so many outdoor cooking devices. This proposal didn't go over well. Requiring 23 families to pay a special fee or tear down structures they had built in good faith was political suicide for the board. Tom and Linda both spoke strongly against the idea, pointing out that it would likely trigger a mass recall of the board and possibly multiple lawsuits. "We made a mistake," Linda said at the meeting. "We had a rule in our covenants that wasn't being enforced, and that didn't align with current safety codes. The solution is to update our covenants, not to punish homeowners who built structures that the city determined were safe." The motion failed to even get a second. Patricia was visibly angry, but she had lost her leverage. Then things took an unexpected turn. Tom, the secretary, requested an emergency board meeting to discuss what he called serious financial irregularities he had discovered while reviewing the HOA's records. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening, and unlike the normal monthly meetings, this one had a tense, urgent atmosphere. Tom presented his findings to the board and the handful of homeowners who attended. According to his research, Patricia had been using the HOA's credit card for personal expenses, including restaurant meals, shopping trips, and even a weekend getaway to Sedona. The charges totaled more than $8,000 over the past 2 years. "I discovered this while reviewing the records for Mr. Edwards's public information request," Tom explained. "The expenses were categorized vaguely as administrative costs or board expenses, but when I requested receipts, they were clearly personal in nature." Patricia tried to defend herself, claiming that the expenses were related to HOA business, that she often met with vendors and contractors at restaurants, and that the Sedona trip had been a retreat to plan the HOA's long-term strategy. But Tom had done his homework. He had contacted several of the vendors and contractors Patricia claimed to have met, and none of them had any record of meeting with her on the dates in question. Richard, Patricia's usual ally, was silent. Linda looked shocked. Karen was furious. "This is embezzlement," Karen said bluntly. "We need to contact our attorney and possibly the police." "That's ridiculous," Patricia said, her voice rising. "I've dedicated countless hours to this neighborhood. I'm entitled to some compensation." "Board members don't receive compensation," Tom said quietly. "That's in the bylaws. And even if you were entitled to reimbursement for legitimate expenses, these are not legitimate expenses." The board voted unanimously, with Patricia abstaining, to place Patricia on immediate suspension pending an investigation. They also voted to contact the HOA's attorney and to file a report with the Gilbert Police Department. I watched all of this unfold with a sense of disbelief. What had started as a dispute over my bread oven had uncovered serious financial misconduct. Part of me felt vindicated that Patricia's behavior toward me had been part of a broader pattern of abusing her position. But mostly, I just felt tired of the whole situation. The police investigation moved forward quickly. Detective Sarah Martinez was assigned to the case, and she reached out to me as part of her investigation since my public records request had inadvertently triggered the discovery of Patricia's financial misconduct. "Mr. Edwards, I understand you've had some issues with the HOA president," Detective Martinez said when she called me. "I'd like to hear your side of the story, particularly regarding how the board handled your permit situation." I told her everything, from the initial police call to my property, through the selective enforcement to the confrontational board meetings. I also mentioned that I suspected Patricia's animosity toward me might have been because I questioned her authority. That fits with what we're hearing from other homeowners, Detective Martinez said. It appears Miss Mitchell has been using her position to settle personal grudges and to benefit financially. We're building a case for embezzlement and potentially abuse of authority. Over the next month, more information came to light. Patricia had apparently been using her position to direct HOA contracts to companies owned by her friends and family members, likely receiving kickbacks in return. She had also been selectively enforcing rules to pressure homeowners she didn't like into selling their homes, sometimes with her real estate agent sister coincidentally showing up to offer help with the sale. The full extent of Patricia's misconduct was staggering. The HOA board hired a forensic accountant who determined that Patricia had misappropriated more than $30,000 over her 3 years as president. Additionally, the contracts she had steered to her associates had cost the HOA an estimated $50,000 more than market rates for the services provided. In September, Patricia Mitchell was arrested and charged with embezzlement, fraud, and abuse of fiduciary duty. The arrest happened in the morning, and by afternoon, the whole neighborhood knew. I saw the police cars outside her house when I left for work, and the story was all over the local news that evening. The HOA board, now led by Linda Wu as interim president, worked to recover the stolen funds. They filed a civil lawsuit against Patricia, and also against the vendors who had participated in the kickback schemes. The board also initiated a comprehensive review of all HOA procedures and implemented new checks and balances to prevent future misconduct. As for my bread oven, the board officially voted to approve it retroactively and to waive the violation fine. They also approved a revision to the HOA covenants that updated the fire safety rules to align with current city codes, which passed with overwhelming support from the homeowners. The legal proceedings against Patricia took several months. Her attorney tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the prosecutor's office was not inclined to be lenient given the amount of money involved and the number of people affected. In February, Patricia pleaded guilty to 1 count of embezzlement and 2 counts of fraud. She was sentenced to 18 months in prison, 5 years of probation, and ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA, including all legal costs. During the sentencing hearing, which I attended along with several other neighbors, the judge made a point of addressing Patricia's abuse of her position. "You were entrusted with the responsibility of managing a community," the judge said. "Instead of serving that community, you used your position to enrich yourself and to harass those who questioned you. This kind of behavior undermines the social fabric of neighborhoods and destroys the trust that makes community living possible." Watching Patricia be led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, I felt a complicated mix of emotions. Part of me was satisfied that justice had been served, but I also felt sadness that things had escalated to this point. If Patricia had just been reasonable about the bread oven, if she had worked with me instead of against me, none of this might have come to light. The HOA moved forward under new leadership. Linda Wu was elected president in a special election, and she immediately set a different tone for the board. She implemented transparent budgeting, regular financial audits, and a more collaborative approach to rule enforcement. The Architectural Review Committee was reconstituted with new members who were instructed to work with homeowners to find solutions rather than looking for reasons to say no. In March, nearly a year after I had first started building my bread oven, the HOA organized a neighborhood block party. It was Linda's idea, a way to rebuild community spirit after the divisive year we had all experienced. I volunteered to provide fresh baked bread for the event, using my now famous bread oven. The night before the party, I fired up the oven and spent hours preparing dough for a dozen different loaves. Bridget helped me shape the loaves and score them, and we worked together late into the evening, enjoying the quiet rhythm of the work. The next day, the party was a huge success. My bread was a hit, with several neighbors asking if I would teach them how to bake. The Carlsons brought pizza made in their oven, creating a fun competition about whose outdoor cooking device was superior. Even old Mr. Henderson set up a table where he educated people about native plants and showed off honey from the bees that pollinated his wildflower garden. As the sun set and the party wound down, I found myself standing next to my bread oven, watching my neighbors talk and laugh together. Tom Bishop, the secretary who had uncovered Patricia's misconduct, walked over to join me. "You know, in a weird way, your bread oven saved this neighborhood," he said. "If you hadn't pushed back against Patricia, we might never have discovered what she was doing." "I just wanted to bake bread," I said, laughing. "I never intended to start a revolution." Sometimes standing up for something small leads to something bigger. You didn't just fight for your right to have a bread oven. You fought for the principle that rules should be applied fairly and that people in authority should be held accountable. He was right, of course. What had started as a simple home improvement project had become a lesson in civic engagement, community organizing, and the importance of questioning authority when it's being abused. In the months that followed, life in Sunset Ridge slowly returned to normal, but it was a better normal. The HOA was more responsive and transparent. Neighbors were more engaged and willing to speak up when they saw problems. And I had discovered a passion for bread baking that brought me joy and connected me with my community in unexpected ways. I continued to use my bread oven regularly, experimenting with different recipes and techniques. I started teaching occasional classes in my backyard, showing neighbors how to work with sourdough starters and how to achieve that perfect crispy crust. Bridget and I even toyed with the idea of someday opening a small bakery, though that remained a distant dream. The bread oven itself became something of a neighborhood landmark. New residents were told the story of how it had inadvertently brought down a corrupt HOA president. Some people thought the story was exaggerated, but those of us who had lived through it knew it was all true. One Saturday afternoon in June, Detective Martinez stopped by my house. She was out of uniform, just doing a neighborhood visit as part of the community policing program. "I wanted to thank you again, Mr. Edwards," she said as I showed her the bread oven. "Your willingness to stand up for yourself and to document everything carefully made our investigation much easier. A lot of people would have just paid the fine and moved on." "I'm stubborn," I said with a shrug, "and I really wanted to keep my oven." "Well, your stubbornness probably saved your neighbors tens of thousands of dollars and prevented who knows how many other people from being harassed. That's something to be proud of." After she left, I prepared the oven for an evening bake. The ritual of building the fire, letting the oven heat properly, and then carefully sliding the loaves inside had become meditative for me. There was something deeply satisfying about working with such simple ingredients, flour, water, salt, and time, and creating something that brought people together. As I pulled the first loaf out of the oven that evening, the crust a deep golden brown and cracking as it cooled, I thought about how much had changed since that day when 3 police cruisers had shown up in my driveway. I had learned a lot about local government, about HOA law, about community organizing, and about my own capacity to fight for what I believed was right. But more than anything, I had learned that sometimes the smallest things, a bread oven, a garden, a splash of color on a front door, are worth fighting for because they represent something larger. They represent our right to make our homes truly our own, to express ourselves, and to build communities based on respect and fairness rather than arbitrary rules and petty power plays. The bread oven stood in my backyard, solid and permanent, a testament to all of that. And every time I used it, every time I shared bread with a neighbor or taught someone how to shape a bowl, I was reminded that good things come from standing your ground, following the rules that matter, and never letting small-minded people dictate how you live your life. The restitution payments from Patricia came slowly. Her assets had been seized, including her Mercedes and much of her jewelry, but she didn't have enough to cover the full amount she had stolen. The HOA would likely be recovering money in small installments for years to come. But at least the bleeding had stopped, and under Linda's leadership, the HOA's finances were finally on solid ground. In August, I received an unexpected visitor. It was Richard Holder, the former vice president who had been Patricia's closest ally on the board. He looked uncomfortable standing on my doorstep, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "Ian, I wanted to apologize," he said. "I supported Patricia in going after your bread oven, and I was wrong. I should have questioned what she was doing instead of just going along with it." I invited him in, and we talked for over an hour. Richard explained that he had been intimidated by Patricia and had convinced himself that strict rule enforcement was necessary to maintain property values. He had never suspected the financial misconduct and felt terrible about his role in enabling Patricia's behavior. "I've learned a hard lesson," Richard said as he was leaving. "Authority without accountability is just tyranny, even in something as small as a homeowner association." His apology meant something to me. It would have been easy for Richard to slink away and hope everyone forgot his role in the situation. Instead, he had taken responsibility and tried to make amends. That took courage. As autumn arrived in Gilbert, bringing relief from the brutal summer heat, the neighborhood settled into a comfortable routine. The new HOA board was functioning well, with none of the drama and conflict that had defined Patricia's tenure. Homeowners were more engaged, attending meetings and volunteering for committees. The sense of community that had been damaged by Patricia's authoritarianism was slowly being rebuilt. My bread oven continued to be a gathering place. On cool October evenings, neighbors would stop by to watch me bake or to sit around the warm oven and chat. The Wungs brought their kids over to learn how to make pizza dough. The Petersons started a tradition of bringing wine to pair with whatever bread I was baking. Even the Carlsons, who I had initially seen as competitors with their pizza oven, became good friends, and we started collaborating on recipes. Bridget's initial skepticism about the bread oven had completely evaporated. She had become as enthusiastic about it as I was, and she had even started contributing to my baking blog with posts about the legal saga and what she had learned about HOA law. "You know what's funny?" she said one evening as we were preparing dough together. "I spent years in law school learning about constitutional law and civil rights, but I never thought I'd be applying those principles to a fight over a bread oven." "You think we overreacted?" I asked. "Part of me wonders if we could have just paid the fine and avoided all this drama." "Absolutely not," Bridget said firmly. "What Patricia was doing was wrong and someone needed to stop her. If it hadn't been you, it would have been someone else eventually. You just happened to be the person who said enough is enough." She was right. I had heard from other neighbors about their experiences with Patricia. The Johnsons had nearly sold their house because of the constant harassment over their red door. The Martinez family had considered moving after Patricia tried to fine them for their playground. Mr. Henderson had lived in fear that Patricia would somehow force him to pave over his wildflower garden. By standing up to her, I had inadvertently freed all of them from that fear. In November, the HOA held elections for open board positions. The turnout was the highest in the neighborhood's history, with over 70% of homeowners voting. Linda Wu was elected to a full term as president. Tom Bishop was re-elected as secretary. Karen Stephenson remained as member-at-large. And 2 new members joined the board, including Mr. Henderson, who wanted to ensure the HOA would protect rather than prohibit gardening and environmental initiatives. At the first meeting of the newly elected board, they voted unanimously to officially recognize my bread oven as an asset to the community and to encourage other homeowners to pursue similar projects that brought neighbors together. They also established a new policy that the Architectural Review Committee should look for ways to approve projects rather than looking for reasons to deny them, within the bounds of safety and reasonable aesthetic standards. This neighborhood should be a place where people want to live, not a place where people are afraid to express themselves, Linda said during the meeting. We're here to maintain property values and ensure safety, but we're also here to build community. The applause that followed her statement was genuine and enthusiastic. It represented a real shift in how the HOA saw its role. As December arrived and the holiday season began, I decided to do something special. I organized a bread baking workshop at my house, free for anyone in the neighborhood who wanted to learn. 23 people signed up, so many that I had to run 2 separate sessions. Teaching my neighbors how to work with dough, how to develop gluten, how to recognize when a loaf was properly proofed, was one of the most rewarding experiences of my life. Some of them would probably never bake bread again, but others caught the bug just like I had. By the end of December, there were 5 active sourdough starters being maintained in Sunset Ridge, and a small group of us had formed a bread baking club that met monthly. The bread oven had become exactly what I had hoped it would be when I first conceived of the project. A tool for creating delicious food, a focal point for community gathering, and a source of personal satisfaction. The fight to keep it had been stressful and time-consuming, but it had been worth it. On New Year's Eve, Bridget and I hosted a small gathering at our house. We invited the people who had been most supportive during the HOA battle: the Petersons, the Wungs, the Carlsons, Tom Bishop and his wife, Linda Wu, and a few others. I spent the afternoon preparing a feast of different breads, from classic sourdough boules to focaccia to cinnamon rolls for dessert. As midnight approached and we all gathered around the bread oven for warmth on the cool desert night, Tom raised his glass in a toast. To Ian and Bridget, who taught us all that standing up for what's right matters, even when it's just about a bread oven. Especially when it's just about a bread oven, Linda added with a laugh. We clinked glasses, and I looked around at the faces of my neighbors, my friends, illuminated by the warm glow of the fire in my oven. This was what community was supposed to be. People supporting each other, standing together against unfairness, and finding joy in simple pleasures like good bread and good company. The new year brought new projects and new challenges, but the lessons from the bread oven saga stayed with me. I learned to question authority when it seemed wrong, to document everything carefully, to build alliances with like-minded people, and to never give up on something I believed in. Patricia Mitchell was released from prison after serving 14 months of her 18-month sentence, reduced for good behavior. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she had moved to another state and was working a retail job, far removed from any position of authority. Part of me hoped she had learned from the experience and would make better choices going forward. But mostly, I just felt relieved that she was gone and that our neighborhood could continue healing. The bread oven still stands in my backyard, used regularly and loved by many. It's been over 2 years since I built it, and it has become a permanent fixture of life in Sunset Ridge. New residents are always curious about it, and I'm always happy to share its story and to offer them fresh bread. Sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I go outside and just look at the oven, remembering everything that happened. The police cars in my driveway, the confrontational board meetings, the discovery of Patricia's crimes, the legal proceedings, the slow rebuilding of community trust. It seems almost unbelievable that so much could stem from one backyard project. But that's the thing about standing up for yourself. You never know where it will lead or who else it might help. My bread oven was just a bread oven, but it became a symbol of resistance against arbitrary authority, a catalyst for uncovering corruption, and ultimately, a tool for bringing people together. I'm grateful for all of it, even the difficult parts. The experience made me a better neighbor, a more engaged citizen, and a more confident person. And every time I pull a perfect loaf of bread out of that oven, golden and crusty and still steaming, I'm reminded that good things are worth fighting for, and that sometimes the smallest battles lead to the biggest victories. The bread oven taught me to bake, but it also taught me to stand firm, to speak up, and to believe in the power of community. Those are lessons I'll carry with me for the rest of my life, long after the last loaf has been baked.